This week, we are revisiting a shape that I've already thrown on this channel before, albeit some time ago. That was my first big batch of these, and this is the second. Setting the pointer is the first thing I do whenever I'm throwing a batch of pots that are meant to be identical. I simply throw the form, measure it with a ruler, and once the form is the correct size, I just set my gauge's pointer to the rim. I like having this physical point to aim for as I'm throwing, as opposed to using a tombu to measure each individual piece, or even a laser pointer. Neither of those give you a physical target like a throwing gauge's pointer does. These pourers are thrown from 12 ounces of clay, or about 340 grams. They're thrown quite thinly too, so I prefer using clay that's perhaps a little bit on the harder side. Of course, this process always begins with centering the clay. I usually cone the lump of stoneware up and down a few times before firmly pushing it into a low, small disc on the wheel head. I then push my index finger and thumb into the center of this disc, and then in a gradual movement I ease them outward, forming the base of the pot. The walls at this point are low and thick, so I pinch them either side and I carefully pull them up, making sure that I use enough water so that the clay doesn't stick to my hands during the process. With every pull, the clay gets taller and the walls get thinner, and this is a process that rewards slow, steady movements. If your fingers linger in one place for too long, you risk thinning out one part of the wall too much. So from the moment I pinch down at the bottom to when I release my fingers at the top, I try to keep that motion very gradual and even. Like Bernard Leach said, you're drawing a line in space, and it can actually be quite a challenge to do this, keeping both your hands perfectly steady and moving them up in a straight, even line. But there are certain things you can do to help this. For instance, I tuck my right elbow into my waist, and this helps to anchor the arm, which adds stability to your movement. But I think really, more than anything, learning to pull cylinders is really just a matter of practice. When I was a student and I was first learning to throw, I would throw cylinder after cylinder until they broke, which not only gets you better at pulling the clay, but it gives you an understanding of what the limitations of the material are. I think it's best to not be too precious at the beginning, as while you might have a strong urge to keep the first dozen or so pots you ever make, or the first 100, the 100 after that, and the 100 after that are going to be so much better than what you were producing at the beginning. Anyhow, let's get back to the pot at hand. As the tops of these pots will have a protruding pouring lip, it means I won't be able to trim near the upper sections of the jug. So because of that, I spend a few moments just pulling and thinning out the upper section of the wall, as I won't be able to trim it later. I also bevel the lip of this pot, so it comes to a fine point on the outside edge of the wall. This helps the pouring lip have a nice fine edge too, later on. But before I can do any of that, I need to scrape off the excess slip on the outside surface of the pot. This not only cleans the form up, it creates a dry surface from which I'll be able to lift the pot away from the wheel with, and it also means that the piece will dry out leather hard more quickly. If instead I left the walls covered in slip and sticky, I'd never be able to lift the pot off from the wheel without distorting it horribly. I then use a soft chamois leather just to go over the rim slightly, and then finally I can pull the spout. I keep a dry finger and thumb either side of the area I'm working. I use a wetted finger to quite forcibly flick out the clay from in between them. This process can distort the shape somewhat, so I spend a moment just pressing it back to be nice and circular, and then I clean up the base and wire off the jug, and then with dry hands I carefully clasp them around the vessel and lift it away, spinning the wheel at the exact same moment I do, to break any seal there might be. And then I can move on to throwing the next, until I have a board full of them. They're more or less identical, and truthfully I don't mind if one's about a millimetre taller or shorter than my throwing gauge. They'll be trimmed anyway, which will change the height somewhat as I trim clay away from the base, but as long as they're more or less identical at this stage, I'm content. Now, this isn't normally how I wrap things overnight. This is what happens when all my shelves are completely full of pots already, but this improvised little damp cupboard works quite well, and it prevents the pots from drying out too much overnight. There's nothing worse than coming in and finding a whole batch of pots ruined as you've let them dry out too much. The next thing I do for all of these is I press in either side of the spout. I do this because as the pulled spouts dry out overnight to leather hard, the shape loosens, and the defined shape they had when freshly pulled on the wheel is lost somewhat. So to remedy that, I just spend a few moments pressing in either side of the spout, redefining and sharpening the lip, which I think makes a big difference in their overall appearance. The more defined spouts look less clumsy, and it also helps to channel the liquid more directly when you pour them. otherwise there can be a tendency for the liquid to sort of cascade either side of the spout too. At this point, the upper walls of these pots are approaching leather hard, but the bases are still quite wet, so I'll move them and separate them so more air can get around each to help dry them out more quickly. As usual, a few of them will be drier than others, such as those thrown at the beginning of the batch, as compared to those thrown last. So I'll set them all out like this, and then I'll do another job while these dry out, such as throwing another batch of pots, or mixing some glaze, or filling the kiln. And as you can see here, these 5 are a little bit too firm around the rim, so I just covered them with some plastic, so they don't dry out too much. A few hours later, once they're all leather hard and ready to be trimmed, I can move them back over to my wheel. To attach each one down, I put some slip on the base, and then carefully rub them into the very centre of the wheel. The friction in combination with the wet slip really holds them in place firmly, but for an added layer of security, I squash down a very small portion of the pot against the wheel head, creating another seal. Once it's securely attached, I can begin to trim, and I like my pots to be very light, and although these were thrown quite thinly too, I still like to always remove a thin skim of clay from the outside of the vessel, not only to remove weight, but also to ensure that I can get a lovely, clean, straight surface. And it's not as if anything's going to waste. For anyone who isn't a potter, all of these trimmings can just be recycled back into usable clay, which can be made into new pots. Now, the tricky thing with these is obviously I can't trim near the top of the pot, where the protruding spout is, without severely damaging it. So to get around this, I sort of have to trim and then stop, like you'll see in a moment. I smooth off the walls, and then as the spout comes around, I stop the wheel, trim, stop, and then, once all of the walls, apart from that little bit underneath the spout, have been trimmed, I carefully scrape that part down by hand. So at this stage I'm getting rid of that little lump you might have seen underneath the spout, and I'm also thinning out the clay and smoothing out this angle so it's nice and even, so it flows nicely. I also use this moment to ensure that the pouring lip is really nice and sharp, as I find a sharp lip really helps to cut the liquid when you stop pouring, which hopefully means it dribbles less, although you've still got to take into account that the vessel will have a layer of glaze put over it, and this too could very well change how well the vessel pours. Once the spout's finished, I slice it off from the wheel head, and then just use a sponge on a stick to smooth off the clay in the area that I was scraping down previously. In theory, I don't need to worry too much, as the glazes that I'll be putting over these later will hide a lot of these marks, but even so, I like to ensure that they're nice and smooth, regardless. In previous videos I've had a lot of questions about this sponge on a stick, and unfortunately I can't remember exactly where I purchased it from. Once the spout has been cleaned up, I just spend a moment or two making sure the diameter, the rim of the pot, is correct, and I also burnish over any sharp particles of sand that were exposed as I brushed over them with the sponge on the stick. I then very, very carefully place the jug on its lip so that I can trim the base. If you don't feel comfortable placing the delicate clay directly on the wheel head, you could use a circular piece of foam to place in between them, or you could even fabricate a chuck that fits inside the jug so the rim never even touches the metal of the wheel head. I then carefully secure the jug in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, which really I'm pushing down against the metal and I'm letting the excess push and hold the jug. I'm not pushing the clay directly into the jug itself, as that could very easily distort and damage it. I then use a sharp, looped trimming tool to clean off the base. I clean up this bottom section of the pot before trimming in a beveled edge on the bottom of the jug, as seen here. By removing what was otherwise a right angle of clay, this creates an edge that's far less susceptible to being chipped, as it's used, put on tables and placed in cupboards. Once the beveled edge has been removed, I then take off a skim of clay across the base, removing the wiring off marks, and then I do some burnishing with the sharp edge of a metal kidney. I'm not trying to make it perfectly smooth, I'm just trying to make it feel consistent. I want someone who picks up the pot to be able to look at the base and know that some care and attention has gone into finishing it. I then stamp it with my small porcelain maker's mark, which is just a simple little F for Florian, obviously. And that's the trimming pretty much done. The next step is the handling, which altogether is a relatively fast process. It's also one that requires very few tools, especially the way I do it. But first, I need to let these pourers sit out for a while, as when freshly trimmed, you reveal softer clay underneath. So I let them sit out for an hour or two, or even longer, depending on what else I'm doing, before I attach any of the handles. There are dozens of ways of making handles. It really just depends on the ways you were taught and which method you prefer to use. I like to pull a series of thick handle blanks, which I then attach to the jugs and then pull again and loop them into shape. I begin with a thick block of clay, which I slap and press into a sort of conical shape. I then cover it in water and gradually pull a length of clay out of it. I grasp near the top of the block, and I grip my hand and I pull that pressure throughout the entire length of the clay. What I'm aiming for really is a long, consistently thick length. I'll then separate this length into many smaller handle blanks. And yes, you could use an extruder to do this, but then you'd have an extruder you need to clean. As a method of pulling handles, this is very quick, and it produces minimal mess, and it also means that you can pull them to any length and thickness you want. You aren't controlled by the hole on your die plate. As I pull, I change which side I'm pulling from every couple of pulls, otherwise you would end up with a sort of teardrop cross-section due to the shape your hand naturally makes. So by constantly switching sides, you ensure that you pull a nice, even cross-section. I judge their length by eye, and then I cut off each blank against the sharp edge of the wooden board. I think it's important to know too that at this stage they don't need to be perfect. These blanks will be attached to the jugs again and pulled further, so any extra fingerprints or marks at this stage really don't matter too much. Not only that, I like to place the handle blanks next to one another, as I really don't want them to dry out too much. One question I'm asked a lot is, how long do I wait before attaching these to the jugs? And the answer is, I don't wait whatsoever. As soon as I've finished pulling all the blanks, I'll begin attaching them to the pots. Obviously, you don't want to use clay for this process that's way too soft, as it'll have less structural integrity, and equally, if you use clay that's too firm, it's just very hard to achieve very nice, flowing shapes. So you want the clay to be soft, but not too soft. The exact same condition of clay that you'd use for throwing is perfect for these, and the softness helps in some ways, as it means it's much easier to blend the handle into the body of the jug, which of course you can still do with firm clay. It just takes a few moments more. As the weather gets warmer, whenever I make handles, I'll begin to pile up these handle blanks, and even wrap them up with plastic and spray them with water, again just to stop them from drying out too much, because if you think about it, you're placing wet clay onto a wooden surface, and often that dry wood is quite absorbent. This means that one side of your handle blank gets much drier than the other, and that could have an effect later on when it comes to actually pulling them on the form of the jug. So if you are just learning to pull handles, and it still takes you quite a long time per piece, it might be worth keeping your handle blanks nice and moist, as this could be something that affects how easy they are to pull later on. You can see a rather raggedy end on the end of this long strap of clay. These are relatively common, and to remove them I simply snip off the end and discard it. I won't actually use it to pull into a proper handle later on. When I was studying how to make handles in college, we were each given a wooden board, and along the board there were very measured little slots where each handle had to go. The slots were drawn with pencil, and basically we had to spend the whole day pulling until we filled every single one with a handle that was the right length and the right width. Just how it takes time to learn how to throw pots identically, the same thing applies for handles too. And if what you're aiming for really are handles that are identical from mug to mug, or from jug to jug, you really need handle blanks that are more or less the same. And it certainly wasn't a skill that I found easy to learn. I really tried to avoid making handles at all costs during my time in college, but thereafter, when I started my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond, I had no choice other than to literally make hundreds of these a week, and when put in that position, you get very good very quickly. Speed when making pottery is simply something that takes time, and handles are no exception. Once all the blanks have been pulled, I can begin to attach them to the jugs. I carefully tap out one end of each of the blanks, creating a sort of flare, a wider portion of clay, which I'll be able to blend very easily into the jug's body. Although during this process, it's still important not to squeeze or damage the length itself. I then score the clay with a serrated kidney, and then just dab on a little bit of slip. Some clay bodies might require more slip and more scoring, some actually don't even require any. It really depends on the type of clay that you've chosen to use. Anyway, I take the blank and I firmly push it into the jug's body. They need to be attached with such force that they stay attached of their own accord. I then pick the jug up, and I take the flare of clay and I blend it carefully into the jug, all the way around. This helps to create a very strong join, which is important, as one of the most common occurrences for those who are just starting to pull handles is they rip them clean off, and this can be either because your initial join isn't strong enough, or that you're using too much pressure when pulling the length of clay. It really is a process where you're both delicate and firm at the same time. It's hard to describe. You have to squeeze forcefully enough that you really move the clay, yet not too hard that you end up ripping the whole thing off or indenting it. At the beginning of each pull, I place my hand right at the top of the handle, where the handle meets the clay of the jug. I grip and I firmly pull down the entire length, and this is important too, as if you release pressure too early, you'll end up building a knot at the end of the handle that gets thicker and thicker, and more often than not, once it reaches a certain size, you'll catch it with your closed hand and you'll pull off the whole handle. I then take the handle by the end and very gently loop it downward. And for this join, due to the angle at which it's attached, I don't have to score it or use any slip. I simply just blend it in quite firmly, like so. And again, there are all kinds of ways of finishing handles. Personally, I just like to join them very naturally, so they flow back into the form. So to do this, I just make it a very smooth transition. And once I feel like I've blended the clay in enough, I'll then use a wetted finger just to completely blend over and smooth all the smudging marks from blending it in. This is another thing that I could perhaps be less careful about, as, again, in theory, all of this will be covered by glaze, so if it isn't absolutely perfect, no one's ever going to see it anyway. I then spend a few moments doing a few little adjustments if the handle needs it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that's it, more or less, for the handle. There is one last thing I do, but usually that's in a day or so, once I've allowed these to dry underneath plastic, very slowly, as that's the key for handles not developing any cracks. For about a day or so, I'll place them onto a board covered in plastic, and at the end of the day, I'll give them a tiny spray down with water, and then I'll wrap them up tightly in plastic. The aim is to get the consistency of the jug and the handle to be exactly the same, and once they're totally even, only then will I begin to dry them out properly. It's a long process really, from beginning to end, and for instance, it's worth knowing that when I was waiting for the freshly trimmed jugs to dry enough that I could attach the handles, I'll be doing other jobs, like throwing more bowls, cleaning the studio, anything really. And I think potters are very good at juggling many different jobs in the studio at any one time, although doing so, and being able to monitor the dryness of all the pots, is certainly a skill in itself. The very last thing for these jugs is just to quickly tidy over the bottom, just one last time. I do this because when you attach the handles, it's very easy to mark the base, be it with a small burr of clay, a scratch, anything really. So I simply just burnish the base of each one last time, before very carefully placing them aside on a wiped clean board. And here's a just handled piece versus a fired piece, just to give you a good idea of how much they'll shrink from beginning to end. Anyway, that's all for this week. I hope you found this video useful, and as always, thanks so much for taking the time to watch.